Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about David Fincher and his amazing filmography. David Fincher started off doing commercials for little brands called Nike and Coca-Cola, and also doing music videos for indie artists such as Madonna and Michael Jackson. But then in 1992 he finally made the switch over to film. He's now considered one of our greatest directors and is still putting out movies to this day. For me personally, I don't think he's ever made a bad film. Yes, some click with me better than others, but also some of them might be a little too complex for my small brain. So let's go ahead and jump into David Fincher's filmography ranked. Mank to me is not a bad movie. I just don't personally have any connections to this story. This feels like a David Fincher passion project. Probably something he wanted to make for a long time and he finally got it off the ground with Netflix. But it seems that Netflix will greenlight pretty much anything. Maybe it's because I haven't seen Citizen Kane, but this movie just doesn't really click for me. I do think there's a few great scenes in here. Gary Oldman gives a great performance. Amanda Seyfried gives a great performance. But out of all of Fincher's movies, if I was given an option to rewatch one of them, this would probably be last. Alien 3 or Alien Cubed is not amazing, but it's not terrible. A lot of people hate on this movie pretty much because they love Alien and Aliens, but I really don't think this movie is as bad as people say. I am going to make a video on the Alien franchise as a whole whenever Romulus comes out in a couple weeks, so I'm going to kind of save my thoughts a little bit, but I will say the studio did mess with this movie a lot and they did not let David Fincher cook, and I have no doubt in my mind that he could have made a great Alien movie, but with the studio interference and the rewrites and reshoots and all of that, re-edits or whatever, it even made David Fincher hate his own movie, and that really is upsetting. Overall, it's pretty disappointing, but I do think there's enough in here that I still enjoyed it as a film and as an Alien fan. I will say though, the CGI aliens was an awful choice. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo might be one I just need to rewatch or something. I think David Fincher's bread and butter is mystery thrillers, and going into this movie I knew loosely that was kind of what it was about. So I had very high expectations from all of David Fincher's past mystery thrillers. I didn't care for really anything going on with Daniel Craig's character and the whole Swedish family mystery. Maybe I just didn't find it as intriguing as like the Rooney Mara subplots that we were getting, but I really enjoyed her character, although I felt like the romance was kind of out of nowhere. I know this movie is based off a book, and maybe if I read that I would appreciate it more, but for me this story just didn't really hit as hard as I wanted it to. But that being said, there is some great acting from Stellan Skarsgård, Rooney Mara. Daniel Craig does give a great performance, even though I didn't really care for his character at all, and it's obviously a well-made movie overall. I also have a problem with movies that are close to 3 hours and they still don't get me invested into the characters, and I really wasn't invested into the characters in this as much as I wanted to be. And it's kind of a similar thing with the next movie I'm going to talk about as well. But this is why David Fincher is so great, because obviously this movie is pretty close to the bottom for me. But I know a lot of people that really love this movie and probably put it in their top 1, 2, or 3. So The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is a good movie overall. Brad Pitt, Cate Blanchett, and Taraji P. Henson gave amazing performances in here. I think there's a lot of very solid themes about aging and life, and there's a lot of great scenes centering that. But this movie's story overall, I was a little lost on. I didn't really care much for the romance between Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett. I did like their acting in the movie, but I didn't feel they had very much chemistry. I was also a little more invested in Taraji P. Henson's character other than like Cate Blanchett, and I kind of felt like they kind of pushed that aside like halfway through the movie, and I didn't really appreciate that. Especially when Queenie dies, I was really expecting it to be a big hit for Benjamin, but it honestly didn't feel like it impacted him that much. I guess you've seen people come and go all the time, but I felt like Queenie should have had a little more respect to Benjamin other than like a random old person at the nursing home. So yeah, there was just a few story aspects that I didn't really appreciate overall, and also the CGI in here wasn't the greatest, and I feel like they should have waited a few years to make this movie. That kind of pulled me out a little bit, but I am willing to overlook that, and that's not a huge flaw for me. There is still a lot of great in this movie, and I can see why a lot of people do love this movie. So Panic Room actually really surprised me. When I saw the David Fincher rankings and stuff, this was always pretty much near the bottom, but for me this movie was everything it needed to be. It was intense and thrilling at times, and all of the acting performances in here were really good in my opinion. This even had a pretty good Jared Leto performance in it, which I was pretty surprised by. With a movie like this where it's centered around one room, it can kind of feel a little bit repetitive at times, but with this, I felt like it was pretty exciting throughout because we were always trying to figure out kind of what was in the room other than just money and where it was at. And also with the daughter being there, it added another layer of intensity because you don't want to see the child get hurt. Especially Kristen Stewart, you have to protect her at all costs. And I also really loved the way that David Fincher played with the camera in here, going in and out of rooms, in between walls. I thought that was pretty interesting and kind of cool. I thought this movie was just everything it needed to be. It didn't overstay its welcome. It didn't get too repetitive. It stayed interesting for me at least. So The Killer came out last year, and I think this movie was really good. I kind of feel like this story applies to how David Fincher feels about himself as a director. He thinks of himself to be a perfectionist, and that's kind of what The Killer is. So I felt like this was very on brand for David Fincher, and it made sense. I also think the inclusion of the Smiths being the whole soundtrack was pretty funny to me, and I honestly enjoyed that a lot. But it was probably just another David Fincher thing where he was like, why not have the whole soundtrack be the Smiths? Because Netflix will pay for it. The action sequences in this movie are all really well done, especially I think the Florida fight scene was one of my favorite fight scenes from last year. But to me, the story in here is just kind of lacking compared to some of his other movies. I'm kind of willing to overlook it because it's not really 100% focused on the story, but we're talking about a revenge movie, and then we get to the end and you want him to do his revenge and then he just walks away. So overall, I was a little disappointed by the ending, but I just think this movie is really cool and really well done. Okay, now I think we're really on to the heavy hitters. On my first watch of the game, I wasn't as into it as I expected it to be. Maybe it's because I thought my ideas were a little bit better. I thought it was going to be a whole like cult mystery scheme thing. And that's kind of what they were setting up the whole time with the paranoia. But that was just too obvious for Fincher. And it just turned into a huge prank. The ending worked way better to me on a second watch, and I encourage you, if you didn't like the game on first watch, please rewatch it. I think it's much better on rewatch. Michael Douglas gives an insane performance in this movie where he's just constantly paranoid and just going through it. I honestly felt super bad for his character, but at the same time, I thought it was a little bit funny. This movie almost feels like a comedy. Like, if you know the ending, I feel like it's funnier every time you rewatch it probably. But yeah, the ending in here will make or break this movie for you, I think. But overall, I thought this movie was really great. The Social Network is an amazing movie. This movie might be Fincher's best made movie because structure-wise, just editing-wise, everything just worked so well in here. I think David Fincher is super interesting with how he structures these stories. A lot of his movies are non-linear, and I think he's really good at knowing when to put those flashbacks in and out of the scenes. Especially in this movie, I thought it was really well done. Jesse Eisenberg probably gives his best performance he'll ever give. I loved him in this movie. I think he is a perfect Mark Zuckerberg. I cannot believe he literally looks exactly like Mark Zuckerberg. This also has one of the best monologues in recent cinema history. It's so fun, it's so insane. I love this movie so much. To me though, I do think that I do emotionally connect to other Fincher films a little more. I didn't really feel much for the characters in this movie. I was just kind of experiencing what was going on and I was along for the ride. I know I'm already breaking the first rule, but I love this movie. Fight Club has aged so well in my opinion. I think it's so funny to seeing the difference of people that really love this movie. There's people that are in on the toxic masculinity joke, and there's people that are not in on it. And I just think it's so funny seeing the difference between the two. Brad Pitt and Edward Norton obviously give amazing performances in this movie. And it's got one of the craziest twists in cinema. It's obviously so in the pop culture that everybody kind of knows this twist, but just imagine it being 1999 and you're in the theater and that happens on screen and just the shock in the whole theater. I can't even imagine. Unfortunately, the first time I did watch this movie, I already knew the twist because it is so in the pop culture, but I do not think this movie relies on a twist. Yes, it's like a huge part of the movie, but it's not like it ruins the rest of the movie because you know the twist. You just see little Easter eggs and you notice little small things that you probably wouldn't have noticed on the first time. Honestly, from like 1 to 5, all of these movies I really just love. So most of these things are just like little nitpicks, or I just didn't emotionally connect to it as much as the other ones that are a little bit higher. And they could probably change around all the time on rewatch or just thinking about it. But yeah, overall, I really love Fight Club. I think it's a great movie. Also, the Where's My Mind scene always gives me chills. 7 is definitely one of the best detective movies out there. Obviously, like most of Fincher's movies, the acting and the cinematography of this movie is phenomenal. I love Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's dynamic in here, and how Brad Pitt was kind of like the up-and-coming cop trying to prove himself, and he was trying to do everything by the books. While Morgan Freeman, he's a little laid back. He kind of knows how to cut corners when he can. And he might be a little bit more like dirtier of a cop, but it's just because he's experienced and he knows how to play the game right. It's also just an amazing idea coming up with like the 7 deadly sins and centering that around the serial killer's motives. The ending of this movie is iconic, and I do think the last like 30 minutes of this movie is just absolutely perfect. But overall, I really do just love 7. I think it's super dark, super gritty, sometimes funny with the dynamics between Mills and Somerset, and a really, really good movie. Gone Girl might climb up to number 1 on another rewatch. Unlike my number 1, I have seen this movie twice, and my number 1 I've seen it I think 3 or 4 times. So I think if I rewatched it a couple more times, it might climb up. But for now, Gone Girl is a solid number 2. This movie would be a very interesting watch with your significant other because you'd really see how crazy they are. Amy Dunn is such an amazing character, and I really loved how we got to peel back all of her layers as we got further and further and deeper into the movie. For the first hour or so, you're still thinking she's missing and oh no, where is she at? But you're also getting these flashbacks and stuff with her and Ben Affleck's character falling in love. And then you start to see why the relationship has been kind of downhill, and then also see that Amy has been behind this all, setting it up the whole time. And then you get to see how far she's willing to go to get away with it. This movie is absolutely insane. I love it so much, but I just have rewatched my number 1 so many times, and it's held up every single time. So with this, I think I need a couple more watches, which is pretty crazy for me to say because both my top 1 and 2 are close to 3 hours, and I love rewatching them, which is pretty insane because I don't love 3-hour long movies. I love like a solid movie under 2 hours, but these are the exception. So overall, obviously, I really loved Gone Girl. Zodiac is a masterpiece. This movie is so intense throughout the whole film. It starts off with an insane opening, and it's absolutely enthralling from beginning to end because of it. I had no idea going into this that the Zodiac Killer was an actual real thing that actually happened. I think it is kind of hard to toe the line of like staying respectful to the victims' families and all of that, and also telling the story. But I do think this movie does do a good job of that. I love that this movie is told from pretty much 3 different perspectives, but mainly Jake Gyllenhaal's character. This movie is so perfect. I think the cinematography, the writing, the acting, obviously, everything about this movie is just so great. And from beginning to end, it is interesting for an almost 3-hour runtime. I am always on the edge of my seat wondering what's about to happen. So yeah, Zodiac is my number 1 David Fincher film, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. David Fincher obviously has an amazing filmography, so I'm definitely going to see a lot of different opinions on this, and probably some opinions that don't line up with mine, and that's okay. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and bye-bye.